What I'd like to do is look at creating a sustainable strategy. So the absolute key item to think about and goal is first in a water strategy is to establish goals. We obviously in our plan have to establish goals. So, and I'll preface some of this by my experience with generally in the mining industry, but some of it specifically referenced Anglo-American because I spent the last many years at Anglo-American. And so this slide is actually some of our thinking at Anglo-American, but it fundamentally says, what if, as we sat and think about the sustainability goals, what if we can have a waterless mine? Well, obviously we can't have a waterless mine because there's obviously water present in the hydrology and hydrogeology, rain, and so forth. But how do we minimize all that? And so there are a number of key attributes. One is obviously to think about consuming minimal amounts of water in our operations, and hopefully even more minimally using clean water that others could use and potentially use others' wastewater. Associated with that, if we can help develop sources of new water, that's also a benefit. So ultimately use recycled water, wastewaters, and of course minimize the total amount of water that we both use and consume. In addition to that, as good members of our society and our communities, if we can, through water, help create sustainable programs that are a benefit beyond the mine to the region and the communities, that's a benefit as well. So that at least creates aspirational thinking, and then that leads to obviously a number of key things. One is operational excellence with respect to water at our sites. It requires partnerships for collaborative action, and I'd like to talk about what some of those may look like. And ultimately, in our view, in my view anyway, it requires some technology to do some of those things. So goals, we have to establish goals, and I'm just showing you some example goals. These, again, I'll reference for Anglo-Americans or are Anglo-Americans. There were two sets with Anglo. We established goals for 2020 because we started our program in about 2015. And then a longer term set of goals for 2030. And just to give you a sense of these, the key goals were a certain % of reduction in freshwater abstraction by 2020, additional reduction in 2030. In fact, a very aggressive goal of 50% reduction in freshwater abstraction by 2030. That's a major goal. There's a metric for water reuse. There's a metric for minimal, what is called 0 level 3 incidences, fundamentally things like pipe breakage or incidences within communities, incidences within water contamination, discharge, and so forth. And ultimately a goal of working with partners to become net water contributors to community. And that's a major goal and a very difficult one to attain. So if we look at within the establishing this program, there's a number of key elements. If we apply the ICMM framework, first and foremost is risk. It's risk-based management approach. And so we have to look at establishing a program and a strategy that has risk at its core and is risk-based. And so I'll expand on that in a bit. A second core enabler is technology. And we need technology basically to, rather than make evolutionary changes, to make revolutionary changes, ones that are meaningful and sustainable, does require technology. We have to create value in our programs. Ultimately, we are a business. Miner is a business. And there has to be value creation, either through additional profitability, ability to operate in a sustainable way over long terms, lower risk to our shareholders, and value creation for our shareholders. And as Haley mentioned, disclosure. We must be transparent. We have to have meaningful disclosure to both shareholders, both internal and external, that provides them with a sense that, one, we know what we're doing, and that two, that we have a set of goals that we're accomplishing. And ultimately, to do all that requires a collective action between the mines, the regions, and the catchments around those mines, and then ultimately our ultimate shareholder base. Haley touched on a bit of this, so let's talk about risk. We have to develop a risk-based approach, and I think that's now obvious. We've had enough incidences around the globe And this certainly is slide simply talking to some of them, which are both operational risks and reputational risks, loss of social license that were related to risk. Some of those have been, as you well know, large and catastrophic. Others have been smaller, but still very meaningful for the miners. And so we must focus toward risk. And so when we look at risk, there's two sets of risks when we think about developing a water plan. One is strategic risk. The key elements are here. It's reputation to the miner. It's things that affect us on a global basis. It affects our potential growth potential in terms of getting permits and joining with society. It affects our social license to operate, and ultimately affects our shareholder value and enterprise value, because water is a triple bottom line metric. And so those are all strategic risks. There are also operational risks, and the key operational risks are simply, first, supply of sufficient water to operations. Two, the other end of that, having too much water and the impacts related to having excess water, and I'll touch on a few of those. And then the third that gets talked about less often is water quality, both the quality of coming to operations and our ability to use it, but also obviously water that's discharged into our communities and the quality of that water and the effect on the communities. So those are the key operational risks. And so when we look at risk management around sites, there are many ways to do this. My preference is to look at it in some sort of portfolio approach where we look at the different elements of a water risk program, and we first develop a gap analysis to say, where are we with these various elements? And that generally provides us with a prioritized roadmap as to where we need to go. There are many ways to conduct a risk assessment. I'm just indicating one example that we've done often in water, which is risk bow ties. I'm just picking one example. In this case, it's the priority unwanted event, which is one of many in a real comprehensive risk assessment. This one happens to be catastrophic shortage of water availability. You can see the critical controls that we identify to manage that, the mitigation controls. And so in this approach, we develop a series of bow ties by identifying the various priority unwanted events, and ultimately build this up at a site level, identify the key priorities, and then if we have multiple sites, obviously develop a corporate portfolio of risk. And again, there are different ways to develop a methodology around risk. This is one way to do it. So let me just briefly touch on some of the key risks with respect to water management. One of the obvious ones is water scarce sites, and this is the one that tends to get a lot of attention. The three primary approaches to managing water risk sites, water scarce sites, first and foremost, is to minimize the amount of water both used and consumed at the site. So demand management and operations is critical, and we could obviously spend a lot of time talking about demand management and strategies around demand management. A second one is to look beyond the fence of the mine and look at the region, and that's water conservation at the catchment or regional basis. So demand management at the region, because today we aren't looking simply at water scarcity at our site, we're looking at water scarcity at the region. Can we access other sources? Where do we stand relative to our priorities versus others in the region, and so on and so forth? Can we use water that others cannot use? And then ultimately, new water. This one should be really the last resort, generating new water or finding new water sources after we've exhausted the options 1 and 2. Additional risks, we certainly need to talk about closure and make sure it's included in our risk management profile. Closure with respect to water management with respect to closure is often the largest risk. It's a risk because we often have water after we've managed the solids for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. And so it needs to be addressed. Related to that is in the area of too much water is stormwater management. Often overlooked, but stormwater management on sites, even in drought areas, can be quite painful. And in fact, there is a requirement for a stormwater management plan. Related to that is of course, flooding, surface flooding, dewatering. This often has major economic implications, both in lost mining or pit time, haul roads, which they become flooded, slope of our workings, where we have to have less of a slope angle because they're wet. So dewatering is a significant risk. Tailings is probably the ultimate water risk at site, and we're all aware of the various issues that we've had with respect to tailings and water management. So managing water on tailings facilities is a critical risk. So when we look at our water management protocols and how do we go forward, we first need to perform a gap analysis. We have to understand where we are today with respect to our operations and with respect to the objectives we have, which are often the ICMM water stewardship objectives. They may be others, other corporately defined ones, and so we need to perform a gap analysis. Following the gap analysis, the key to that, of course, is the site-wide water balance. That sets the stage for really defining all of our sources and uses of water, and on a both seasonal and annual average. A climate plan is critical. Are we having more water, less water, and what's the view forward? And ultimately, again, the catchment-wide or the region-wide water balance to understand where we sit as a good neighbor in a community, in our communities. Ultimately, all those packaged together gets us to development of a sustainable water plan. And I would submit that sustainable water plan really should be part of the sustainable mine plan. It ultimately should be a single plan. So what does a plan look like? Well, here's an example. The key objectives in this particular plan is at the left, it's operational excellence. On the demand side, how do we minimize? On the right side, it's collaborative action for various partnerships in the region for regional demand management. And then in the center of that is technology to continuously improve. Specific programs that are part of this plan: site-wide water balances, which we've indicated are critical, a regional or catchment-wide water balance. One that we should touch on is water organizations. All this is about people, and it takes people to execute. And so it's critical that the sites have a designated water manager, a water team. They have to sit in a responsible position in the site hierarchy and the organization, and ultimately in the corporate one as well. And from that, we can create hopefully one integrated water management program at site that should be joint with programs we have for the region, for the communities. They're obviously typically water-related programs within the communities. And that's all should be one water program. The objectives of all this is water security. That means having sufficient water for our mining operations, discharging water that's manageable and acceptable for the period of our mining operations, and ultimately recognized as responsible water stewards in our region. And if we're quite good at this, then providing water for our regions as well. Another key tenet of this is water reporting. We must monitor, we must collect data appropriately, and we have to report it both internally and externally. Haley talked about transparency, and part of transparency, a good part of transparency, is providing data to our shareholders and our stakeholders that's meaningful, that they understand, that they accept, that's credible. That all helps with our position as miners in the greater community and for our triple bottom line. So water reporting is critical. ICMM had spent quite a lot of time, ICMM members, to developing a coherent approach to reporting, which incorporated the Australian water accounting framework into a coherent way to do the various reportings both internally and externally that was required. There are a number of definitions that were then defined so they were consistent across the various reporting methodologies, and we won't spend time walking through these, but freshwater abstraction, withdrawal, consumption, intensity, what constitutes reuse and recycle. These became important so that miners could set their base for so that each could compare against each site and or each other, and then of course to report to the external community. And I won't walk through the various reporting definitions, but just to make you aware of the differences between the existing water accounting framework and the ICMM water reporting guidelines. Just to note, there are a number of differences that became really important. As an example, simple definition, freshwater abstraction, using this example here from a bore well or from surface, if the water is used on site for operations of some sort, then it's considered freshwater abstraction. It must be counted. If it is not and recycled to the environment or discharged to the environment without use, then or contamination, then it's not counted as part of the freshwater abstraction. So examples like that become important. And this is simply another one, looking at rainwater, glacier water. If it's on the mine site and used or consumed, then it is part of freshwater abstraction and counted. If it is not and flows off into the natural environment, it's not included. And so these are just some simple examples of definitional differences. But the ultimate, moving to the gap analysis, is the site-wide water balance. We must have an operating site-wide water balance. It's critical for obviously site management of water, reporting, development of strategy, development of capital programs, and so forth. And so it provides the framework for a water stewardship program. I'm not going to walk through this example on the left, but of a site-wide water balance, but it must be operational. It should not be sitting on a shelf as a report. It needs to be, in essence, in real time, so that we understand what's stored, what's available, what's at different unit operations. It should include climate, and it's normally as part of some model, Gold SIM, OpSIM, or other. But ultimately, we need to make sure that our sites each have an operating site-wide water balance. That leads us then to the catchment-wide balance, or we may say regional, because certain mines actually have more than one catchment in their regionally influenced water. That simply means we're now outside the fences of the mine. We're looking at all the water in the influenced region, and then we do another assessment, an accounting, if you will, of the available sites, of available amounts of water, the quality of that water, what's discharged, and it's from power plants, municipalities, other miners, agriculture. All of those become relevant in looking at where we stand as a miner in that region. Are we a significant consumer? Are we a significant discharger? And that then gives us, with the regional balance, gives us with that information, it gives us the ability to understand what collaborative programs we can put in place to either access additional water, to opportunities to discharge our water, and or where each can share. Just a couple of brief examples. This is particularly Anglo-American, Las Bronces, Chile. Looking at that copper site, and we were able to identify a number of power plants, agriculture organizations, municipalities, other miners. And as a result, that site is able to identify additional sources of water, both fresh and non-fresh, including mine wastewater, that could be used for source water for Las Bronces. So it creates the regional balance creates collaborative programs that gives us a very powerful tool toward providing sustainable water forward. We don't have to be responsible for just the water on our own site. Another example, this happens to be the Limpopo region of South Africa, looking at the various water sources, both source water, dams, insufficient water, etc. And so once we understand that for a particular mine, we can understand what's available, where the issues are, where the stress is, where we have to add focus. So that brings us to development of a regional water balance. And obviously, there's a number of ways to do this. I won't touch on the details, but just the key concepts in a regional water balance says that we have to do, in essence, a water census. We need to do an accounting of all the available water, all the available discharges, who's doing what's the quality. There are various ways to model that. I would say that at Golder, we've developed a software, an approach for developing a regional water balance, which we think is fairly powerful. And ultimately, that gives us a catchment or a regional water balance. So we know what our sources are. We know the general flows, surface and subsurface. It gives us data that's basically spatial, in terms of GIS, where's it available, where it's not. It gives us data that's time dependent, so we can look at time sequencing. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is population increasing in a region? And will that take more water or less water? And it allows us to develop various dashboards and for our metrics, so that we understand where we are as a citizen. Do we have too little? Where we have too little? Do we have too much? Are others, are the dams at the level that we need them to be at? And if not, why? And so on. So it's a very powerful tool to manage our long-term sustainability. This is just more of a detail to give you a sense of the outputs. And ultimately, it's the outputs that counts, both at the site level, the corporate level, and ultimately to our shareholders, so external level as well. So we can create site dashboards, we can create corporate dashboards, and/or if we choose, external dashboards that allow us to identify the risks, allow us to identify where we're abstracting or could abstract, where we're discharging, where others are discharging. And so we can make this as complex or as simple as we like, but it's fundamentally a series of data, and from that we can then model our way forward and develop a plan forward that is believable and understandable. Just to give you one more quick graphic of this, because one of the critical ones is the storage levels. This is an example of a dam and the levels under various scenarios that we would apply for either water consumption or reuse. And so it's a very powerful tool to think about what our opportunities are, and also various models under climate, which brings us to our next subject, which is climate. We must understand climate. Really, again, there's two key criteria. One is long-term effect. Is it leaving us with more water at the site or less water? And second, what's it doing to us in terms of seasonality? Are there floods? Are there not floods? What's the amplitude of those either drought or flood events? And so we in our regional balance and our long-term, we'll do some level of modeling. This is simply an example from Southern Africa, looking at our models forward at various years and what the impact is then on our mine plan. With all of that data, it leads us to how do we do better? And how we do better is collaborative action. Collaborative action means working with others in our communities and our region to develop programs. Here's an example of a beneficial reuse. It says, look, we as a miner have an opportunity to use some of our pit dewatering water. We don't need it. We have an ability to generate crops in the region. This particular example is in South Africa. But I would say to the miner, it's not just a matter of saying, here's the water, can you use it? Often it's a matter of working with the communities to say, what kind of crops can you plant? What are most efficient? How do you generate an economy for them? Remembering that agriculture consumes about 70+% of all the water worldwide, it's an obvious beneficiary of beneficial reuse. And so this makes us a good partner for communities, as an example. Another example, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention eMekeleni in South Africa, which is a consortia of a number of coal mines taking wastewater, acid mine drainage and wastewater, treating it for both reuse as drinking water for the region and it's for discharge. It's been very successful, and it's a good example of reuse of an asset, of a waste material, but also collaborative action among a number of miners. And so I think under collaborative action, we'll see more and more of these programs. So where does that leave us? That leaves us ultimately with, looking first steps, and we have to start with the first step. And the first step is certainly, where are we today? This is simply an example of a self-assessment, looking per site. And Brendan is going to spend more time with this and lead us through it. But we have to understand where we are and what our priorities are. And why do we need to do that? Well, several reasons. One of them is if we look forward, water is clearly critical for mining today, but it's becoming even more critical. Commodity demand's continuing to expand. We know that most of that demand will actually be in regions that are extreme water scarce region. Water consumption and mining is going up, not down, and it's very significant to our capital plan as well. And so and overlaid with that, of course, is increased shareholder sensitivities to water management within mining. So that makes this business critical, and it means that it's not an option anymore. These are things we have to do in terms of development of a water stewardship plan.